Just after 8 on the morning of November 28th, 2020, a Houston city worker driving his route along Red Hall Lane spotted something in the brush at the edge of the road. It was a woman in her 20s, lying there with no visible injuries, and detectives believed she'd been there overnight, roughly 17 miles west of downtown Houston. Within days, the whole country would know her name. She was Alexis Sharkey, a 26-year-old Instagram influencer with a polished feed and more than 20,000 followers. When that worker found her, nobody had yet reported her missing, not even her husband. Long before she was a Houston influencer, she was Alexis Robinot, the oldest of three daughters from Youngsville, a small town in northwestern Pennsylvania. She graduated from Youngsville High School in 2012 and earned a biology degree from the University of Pittsburgh at Bradford in 2016, with minors in nutrition and psychology. Her mother later told reporters that Alexis had originally planned on medicine, but a gap year after college nudged her onto a different road entirely. That road led to West Texas, in the oil country around Midland and Odessa, where she crossed paths with Thomas Sharkey. He was an oil field worker more than 2 decades her senior, a man who'd already lived a whole life before her, including a grown daughter from an earlier chapter of it. A friend later recalled that Alexis was working at a local bar when the two met. Whatever the spark was, it moved fast, and they took a multi-month trip together to Colorado in 2019, soon after meeting each other. On December 20th of that year, they got hitched. She was 25, and he was in his late 40s, a fact which raised some eyebrows. A few weeks later, in January 2020, they relocated to Houston and settled into an apartment on the city's west side. By then, Alexis had built something of her own. She worked with Monat, a multi-level marketing company selling skincare products, and she'd climbed the ranks to executive director. Her Instagram showed the version of her life you'd expect from someone in that world. All the usual travel photos and the polished beauty content. The Instagram feed, of course, wasn't the whole story, and the reality was much darker than she publicly let on. In October 2020, Alexis took a trip to Marfa with several girlfriends. Marfa is a tiny town out in the West Texas desert, a strange and beautiful place for the conversation that ended up happening there. On that trip, according to one of the friends, Alexis opened up in a way she rarely did, and the friend came away convinced that Alexis was petrified, scared for her own life. The friends who spoke publicly about that conversation declined to name the person she was afraid of. Investigators would eventually fill in that blank. Police said after the case ended that they'd established a history of violence in the marriage, though no report was ever filed with authorities while Alexis was alive. By November 2020, the two had effectively separated, and it looked like the short marriage would soon be coming to a close. Her friend said publicly that Alexis had recently opened up about the relationship and that a divorce was being filed. Tom wanted to reconcile, and Alexis, by all appearances, had no interest in staying married. None of that turmoil showed up online, and she kept posting content to Instagram indicating things were going well in her life. On November 22nd, 2020, she posted to Instagram for the last time photos from a trip to Tulum in Mexico. 3 days later, on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, she talked with her mother, Stacy Robinot, about plans for Christmas. On Thanksgiving itself, the accounts diverge in a significant way, and Tom later claimed the couple shared a holiday meal that morning. Her friend said Alexis spent Thanksgiving with them, not with her husband, and that the group made plans to meet that Saturday to watch movies together. Alexis was last seen alive around 6 in the evening on Friday, November 27th. What happened at that apartment on Friday night is something only 2 people ever knew, and neither of them can tell us now. What we have are Tom Sharkey's accounts, and they didn't stay consistent. In one telling, she left home on foot after an argument, and then simply vanished after that. In another, he insisted there was no fight at all, just him warning her that she shouldn't drive under the influence before she walked out anyway. Her family and her friends were suspicious of him almost immediately, and one piece of geography goes a long way toward explaining why. The couple's apartment sat only about 3 miles from the spot where her body would be found. Her phone went quiet that night, and calls went unanswered, and messages sat unread. For a woman friends described as practically inseparable from her phone, the silence was concerning. The next morning came the discovery on Red Haw Lane, near the Katy Freeway and Eldridge Parkway in Houston's Energy Corridor. Police noted there was no evidence she'd walked down that road herself, and no sign that anyone had tried to conceal her. She'd simply been left there. The worker who found her later gave an interview about that morning, recalling that she looked clean and almost unmarked. This confirmed to detectives that she had almost certainly been dumped in that location by the perpetrator. That same day, Tom called Alexis's family in Pennsylvania to tell them she was missing, and her mother later said the household went straight into panic mode. But it was her friends, not her husband, who actually contacted police to report her missing, and by the time they did, her body was already lying in the Harris County morgue, unidentified. Tom, despite letting people know she had disappeared, never filed a report at all, which immediately raised further suspicions. On Sunday night, Stacy Robineau posted again, this time with the news every parent dreads, writing that her daughter's body had been found. On Monday, November 30th, Houston police publicly confirmed the identification. From the first days, Tom Sharkey's odd behavior drew significant attention both from the authorities and from Alexis's friend. He posted on social media, thanking people for their support in the search, then lashed out at anyone pointing fingers at him. He wrote that his critics should be ashamed and insisting he'd been assisting deputies and working the phones to find out what happened to his wife. He said he was receiving death threats and that he was also a victim in this situation, which is an odd thing for a supposedly grieving husband to say. The case had gone national by then, and the online attention was ferocious, with amateur sleuths picking apart the couple's social media and floating theories about what happened. When a Houston television reporter reached him by phone, he said he'd done everything in his power to find her, told the reporter never to contact him again, and hung up. A day later, he agreed to an interview after all, insisting that he was prepared to tell the truth about the entire situation. In it, he described Alexis as stressed and not as happy as she appeared on social media, but insisted the marriage itself was a good one and denied that any divorce was in the works. He cast himself as the person who'd been holding her together through it all, and he ended the call abruptly. He insisted he wasn't a bad guy, just a man who'd been destroyed by the gossip and rumors floating around online. Then came the tells. 2 weeks passed without Tom making any funeral arrangements. The medical examiner's office took the unusual step of switching her next of kin from her husband to her parents. A private funeral went ahead on December 19th, and the family deliberately kept the arrangements secret from him. Around that same 2-week mark, Tom packed up and left Texas altogether, resettling in Georgia. For 7 weeks, the case sat in an official gray zone because the cause of death hadn't been established. That ended on January 19th, 2021, when the Harris County Institute of Forensic Sciences released its finding. Alexis Sharkey's death was a homicide. She had been strangled, which explained why the person who found her hadn't seen any visible injuries on her body. It was the finding her mother had been bracing for since November, and it moved the case out of the realm of speculation. The ruling turned the investigation into a criminal case, and the man who'd left the state without arranging his wife's funeral was now the obvious center of gravity. Publicly, though, Houston police stayed quiet, and for most of 2021 the case looked stalled from the outside, but it wasn't. Behind the scenes, detectives spent those months building a file, and one thing they wanted was Tom Sharkey's DNA. He proved remarkably hard to pin down, and police later described him as untruthful and evasive throughout. In August 2021, when Houston detectives traveled to Georgia for an arranged meeting where he was supposed to provide a sample, he didn't show up. They'd crossed several states to hear him explain himself, and he left them waiting. Detectives said Tom later offered a bizarre story to explain why he'd essentially disappeared. And a short time after that failed meeting, he relocated again, this time to Florida. By late September, the investigation had reached its conclusion, one that should perhaps seem quite obvious given the circumstances of the case. Detectives determined that Tom Sharkey was the only person with the means, motive, and opportunity to have committed the brutal act, and that he'd acted alone. They'd chased down and eliminated the alternative suspects, including, notably, some that Tom himself had tried to point them toward. On September 29, 2021, police obtained a warrant for his arrest on a murder charge. Because the case was so high profile, they kept the warrant quiet while they worked out how to serve it, and not even Alexis's own family knew it existed. Deputy U.S. Marshals traced him to a relative's home in Fort Myers, Florida, reportedly the residence of his daughter and her boyfriend. Late on the night of Tuesday, October 5th, the marshals knocked on the door, and it quickly became clear that there would be no trial in this case. When Tom Sharkey realized who they were and why they'd come, he ran upstairs, and before anyone could reach him, he eliminated himself. The next day, a police spokesman stood before cameras in Houston and laid out the case in broad strokes. He confirmed the history of violence and the divorce Alexis had wanted. He declined to detail the physical evidence, explaining that her parents deserved to hear it before the public did. And that's where the official record comes to an end, with the family's wishes for privacy being respected. There would be no courtroom test of his shifting stories, and no jury would ever weigh the file that detectives had spent 10 months assembling. Much of what detectives gathered has never been made public at all, which means the full evidentiary picture of that Friday night has stayed locked in a case file in Houston. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with my usual reminder to hit the notification bell and turn on all notifications. Also, don't forget to hit that share button and send this video to your friends and family members who enjoy true crime content. At 6 o'clock in the evening on December 18, 2022, a YouTube channel called Vote Saxon 07 went live. For the next 6 hours, its host sat on camera playing Grand Theft Auto Vice City, chatting to his 37,000 subscribers. He apologized that technical problems meant he couldn't read the live chat, and mentioning the current time again and again as the night wore on. While that stream was running, a man carrying a backpack walked onto a quiet residential street in Lurgan, in County Armagh in Northern Ireland. He left again 38 minutes later wearing different clothes. Inside one of the houses on that street, a pregnant woman named Natalie McNally had just been killed. The man on the stream and the man with the backpack were the same person, and the broadcast, as police would eventually prove, had been recorded 4 days earlier. What followed was a multi-year saga of lies and deception that ultimately ended with the killer locked behind bars. Natalie McNally was 32 years old. She held 2 degrees, worked as a marketing executive with TransLink, and owned her own home at Silverwood Green in Lurgan. She followed Armagh's Gaelic footballers and Everton with equal devotion and doted on her cats and dogs. She also turned up at rallies against violence toward women and girls, a detail that reads very differently and tragically now. Her parents, Noel and Bernadette, lived a short drive away in Craigavon, and she remained close to them and to her brothers. In August 2022, she matched on the dating app Bumble with Stephen McCullough, a 32-year-old from Woodland Gardens in Lisburn, about 20 minutes up the road. McCullough had a modest online following, posting gaming videos to an audience of roughly 37,000 subscribers. The relationship moved quickly, and by November, Natalie was telling her family she was pregnant with his child. Those around the couple believed McCullough was delighted. An old college friend of his would later testify that he seemed excited about becoming a father, and he went as far as buying an engagement ring. There was, however, another side to the story, something that painted a much less happy picture. Transcripts of Natalie's messages to other people, later read in court, suggested she was having doubts and may have been thinking about ending the relationship. Whether McCullough knew and what it did to him if he did is a question that hangs over everything that followed. Sunday, December 18th, 2022 was World Cup final day, and Natalie watched Argentina beat France at her parents' house in Craigavon. Sometime after 5 p.m., she headed back to Lurgan. She was 15 weeks pregnant, didn't yet know whether she was having a boy or a girl, and had a scan booked for the coming Tuesday. At 8:52 p.m., a security camera captured a man with a backpack entering Silverwood Green on foot. At around 9 p.m., two of Natalie's neighbors separately heard banging and screaming coming from her home. One man recalled seeing a large shadow on the blinds of the patio doors, but neither of them realized what they were hearing. At 9:30 p.m., cameras picked up the same figure leaving the area, now dressed in different clothing. At 10:46 p.m., a taxi driver named Jeff McAvoy picked up a male passenger outside Fat Joe's bar on Carnegie Street in Lurgan Town Center. The rider directed him to a house in Lisburn, and the taxi's GPS logs showed it stopping outside McCullough's home on Woodland Gardens shortly after 11:10 p.m. McCullough's own cell phone, meanwhile, had gone silent at around 6 p.m., just as the stream began, and showed no activity again until 11:16 p.m. For the entire window in which Natalie was attacked, the phone of the man supposedly live streaming from his living room was completely dark. Nobody found Natalie that night, and it wasn't until around 10 p.m. the following evening, Monday, December 19th, that McCullough arrived at Silverwood Green and dialed 911. He told the operator he'd discovered her body, that there was blood everywhere, that she felt cold, and that she was pregnant, with a scan booked for the very next morning. A recording of that call, played to a jury more than 3 years later, captured him sounding distraught as the operator talked him through CPR. The first paramedic on scene found that her hands and lips had already turned blue. Police officers who followed noted a knife lying a few feet from her body in the living room, and blood on the floor and the walls. There was no sign of forced entry, which told detectives from the start that Natalie had almost certainly opened her door to someone she knew. The post-mortem documented dozens of injuries to her upper body, and while I don't usually get into the details, I think it's necessary here. She'd been stabbed 3 times in the neck, sustained lacerations to the top of her head, and suffered fractures to her face and broken bones in her neck, consistent with manual strangulation. The pathologist couldn't single out one definitive cause of death, because either the stab wounds or the compression of her neck could have been fatal on their own. What he could say was that she had endured a prolonged assault, something that detectives would view as highly personal. The Crown would later put the attack itself between 8:50 p.m. and 9:30 p.m. on the Sunday night, which meant Natalie had lain undiscovered in her own living room for roughly 24 hours. McCullough, for his part, was arrested at the scene that night on suspicion that he was the perpetrator. He told officers he couldn't have done it because he'd spent the entire previous evening live streaming on YouTube. On paper, it checked out. There on his channel sat a 6-hour video titled The Violent Night Christmas Live Gaming Stream. Now, it's never been proven, but I can't help but wonder if this title was a subtle tell, or perhaps even a way to make his alibi look even more airtight. After all, it seems like the absolute worst video title given what happened that night. The stream had gone out between 6 p.m. and midnight on the night in question. In it, McCullough played Vice City, talked to his audience, and repeatedly referenced the time. He explained early on that technical issues meant he couldn't interact with the live chat. Detectives watched it, and within a day he was released, effectively ruled out as a suspect. Before his release, in a formal interview the day after the discovery, McCullough answered no comment more than 80 times on his lawyer's direction. Though he did volunteer one thing. An ex-boyfriend, he said, had been harassing Natalie in the weeks before her death. What followed was, in hindsight, one of the most disturbing chapters of the whole case, when, for weeks, McCullough played the grieving partner. He was welcomed into the McNally family's home and comforted by them at Natalie's wake on Christmas Day. He showed her parents the engagement ring he said he'd bought for her, and repeated to them the same suggestion he'd made to police, gently steering suspicion toward another man. When detectives asked him for a routine witness statement describing the scene as he'd found it, he declined, saying his lawyer had advised against it since he'd initially been treated as a suspect. Meanwhile, Northern Ireland and all the United Kingdom grieved the loss of Natalie. Natalie had been cut down a week before Christmas, pregnant, in her own home, and the news landed hard. Vigils were held in her memory. Her name appeared on placards at rallies, and her family began what would become a years-long public campaign for justice. Through all of it, in those early weeks, McCullough stood alongside them, playing perfectly the role of the grieving boyfriend who lost his future wife to senseless violence. On December 22nd, police released the surveillance of the backpack man and asked the public for help identifying him. They renewed the appeal over the holidays and returned to the Silverwood greenhouse in early January for a fresh examination of the scene. In mid-January 2023, detectives arrested a 46-year-old man in South Belfast in connection with the case, but he was released on bail the following day and never charged. The investigation kept circling back to the same unanswered questions. Who was the figure on the video, and why did the boyfriend's phone go dark for the exact window of the attack? Piece by piece, detectives traced the backpack man's full journey. A masked individual matching McCullough's build was seen boarding a bus in Dunmurry near Lisburn and traveling toward Lurgan, then continuing on foot to Silverwood Green. Cameras near his own home even caught a figure tossing two objects over a hedge beside the property on his return. The taxi driver, Jeff McAvoy, later picked McCullough out of a police lineup as the passenger he'd driven to Woodland Gardens. Then the cybercrime unit took his computer apart, and what they found dismantled the alibi entirely. The streaming software OBS Studio showed no background activity during pauses in the broadcast, something that couldn't happen in a genuine live transmission. As someone who has been a streamer before, there would, at the very least, need to have been some sort of button press to transition the screen over to the pause screen. Forensic analysis established that a single 6-hour recording had been created on December 14th and saved in the early hours of December 15th. It had then been manually deleted and the recycle bin emptied shortly after midnight on December 19th, just after the broadcast wrapped up and while Natalie's body still lay undiscovered. The analysis also showed no user interaction with the computer at all between 6 p.m. and midnight on the night of the attack. Whoever's face was on that stream, nobody was sitting at that computer on the night in question. On January 31st, 2023, McCullough was rearrested, and on February 2nd, he was charged. At the initial hearing, a detective chief inspector told the court that the surveillance trail, the taxi driver's evidence, and the hours-long silence of McCullough's phone all tied him to the crime. Under questioning after his rearrest, McCullough finally admitted the video had been recorded around December 14th. He said that there was an innocent reason for this, though he offered no explanation for the senseless cover-up. He claimed that he spent the evening of the 18th getting absolutely hammered at home before falling asleep. Confronted with the mountain of evidence, he offered a new theory. The real culprit had deliberately laid a trail of circumstantial evidence to frame him. This was consistent with his previous attempts to pin the crime on other people, though this time, no one was buying what he was selling. Bail was refused, repeatedly, and I ended up going down a bit of a rabbit hole on Northern Irish law on this one. His bail was denied, mainly because a Northern Irish court believed there was a real risk that he could interfere with witnesses or obstruct the prosecution. The prosecution pointed to allegations that he had created a false alibi using a pre-recorded YouTube live stream. They also noted he continued interacting with Natalie McNally's family after her death. It also came to light that he secretly left his phone in their home to record their conversations and learn whether they or the police suspected him. At one bail hearing, he was also found to be a flight risk, and it was determined that confiscating his passport wouldn't be enough to ensure that he didn't go on the lam. At a pretrial hearing in March 2023, prosecutors described the case as strong and persuasive and disclosed a detail that made headlines across the world. During the pre-recorded session, McCullough had gone out of his way to play an optional Grand Theft Auto Vice City side mission called Waste the Wife. Now, if you're familiar with this series, I'm sure you can figure out what this side quest entailed, but if you're not, it involves the player eliminating someone's wife. The player has to stage her death to look like a car accident, thus preventing the police from realizing what actually occurred. The prosecution suggested this mission was a hidden message, a taunt embedded to her family in the recording. His defense called it a tragic coincidence and stressed that the case was entirely circumstantial. McCullough formally pleaded not guilty in January 2024, and in November 2025, the trial was adjourned when 30,000 pages of new material were served on the defense. By the time a jury was finally sworn in at Belfast Crown Court on February 16, 2026, before Justice Patrick Kinney, more than 3 years had passed since Natalie's death. The prosecution, led by Charles McCreener, opened by telling the jury the attack was planned, calculated, and premeditated, and that McCullough's tearful call had been a performance. Over 5 weeks, the Crown built its case strand by strand. Jurors watched sections of the fake stream, including the moment McCullough explained why he couldn't read the chat. They were shown a compilation of footage from doorbell cameras and a bus, following the masked traveler from Dunmurry to Lurgan and back out again by taxi. A detective from the cybercrime unit walked them through the streaming equipment evidence, and the forensic pathologist described Natalie's injuries. The human testimony cut deepest, and it really drives home what an absolutely sick individual McCullough is, because most people can't pull this off with a straight face. Her parents described how McCullough had grieved alongside them and shown them the ring, claiming that he had lost the love of his life. His old friend recalled him being inconsolable about the entire thing without showing a single sign that he was responsible for the brutal crime. Then an ex-girlfriend of McCullough's testified that he'd attacked her several times during their 7-year on-and-off relationship. After she delivered a stillborn baby in early 2022, she'd received private counseling sessions at his house, which police later told her he had secretly recorded. Jurors also watched recordings of McCullough's police interviews from early 2023, in which detectives showed him all the evidence and invited him to explain it. He showed no emotion, gave them nothing in the moment, then later handed over a prepared statement insisting the case was entirely circumstantial. The statement said that he wasn't the man in the footage and that someone was framing him, which I can't imagine looked very good to jurors. His actions showed a lack of basic human emotion that one would associate with the loss of one's bride-to-be and your own unborn baby in such a tragic and horrific attack. The defense, led by John Kearney, aimed everything at one target: Natalie's ex-boyfriend. The two had met on Tinder in 2019 and carried on an on-off relationship for years, with a final encounter at her house as late as October 2022, while she was seeing McCullough. The man admitted from the witness box that he'd lied to detectives about when he last saw her in an effort to diminish his temporal connect to Natalie. He also admitted that he'd factory reset his phone when police arrived because he'd recently been arrested over threatening messages to a former partner. But he'd been watching the World Cup final at home with his current girlfriend that night, an alibi she corroborated on the stand, and a short video taken at the time supported. Over 3 days of cross-examination, he held to one position. He'd told lies about other things, but he had nothing to do with Natalie's death. At one point, he turned the accusation directly on McCullough in open court, saying that he was the one who did it. Had the case against McCullough been weaker, the series of lies and half-truths he told may have created reasonable doubt, but spoiler warning, they didn't hear. When his turn came, McCullough declined to testify, and his lawyer called no witnesses at all on his behalf. Now, there's nothing unusual at all about an accused choosing not to testify, especially given how brutal cross-examination can be, even for an innocent person. What is unusual is that no expert witnesses were called with respect to any of the surveillance evidence or phone evidence. Simply put, the prosecution had experts testify as to why McCullough was the man on the tapes, but McCullough's defense had no expert evidence to push back and create doubt. Now, it's not necessary for the defense to do anything whatsoever, since there's no reverse onus on the defendant, but the lack of any pushback on the prosecution's experts is unusual. In closing, the prosecution argued he'd lied to everyone, in every direction, until each lie was disproven, and that his silence in the face of a compelling case spoke for itself. The defense answered that a wholly circumstantial case with strands pointing at another man was the very definition of reasonable doubt. Justice Kinney reminded jurors that the ex-boyfriend wasn't the person on trial and instructed them to weigh each bit of evidence individually. From there, they would then decide whether the strands of evidence they accepted, taken together, proved guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. On March 23, 2026, after about 2 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a unanimous verdict of guilty. Natalie's relatives cheered the result, metaphorically speaking, from the public gallery. But despite this result, McCullough showed almost nothing in the way of emotion. Justice Kinney told him the conviction carried a mandatory life sentence, with the minimum term to be fixed at a later hearing. Within hours, YouTube terminated his channels, which had remained online throughout the trial, and had actually gained subscribers while he awaited it. He was immediately moved to protective custody amid reported fears of a revenge attack from fellow inmates. Given that Natalie was pregnant at the time, it was believed that even serious offenders would take the opportunity to dish out some prison justice on him. Ultimately, the latest reports suggest that he may never be returned to the general prison population and that he may serve his entire sentence in protective custody. At a hearing on May 21st, the court learned that McCullough had told a probation officer after the verdict that he might have been responsible but had no memory of that night. He'd reportedly described himself as a monster to that officer and claimed he was suffering from psychological problems as a result of coming to accept this. The prosecution called his contradictory statements an attempt to manipulate a future parole board and sought a minimum term of between 27 and 35 years. And I have to agree, this was clearly an attempt to further manipulate the situation. His defense argued for 15 or 16 years, though there doesn't appear to have been any cogent argument why he should get such a light sentence given the circumstances. On June 3, 2026, Justice Kinney sentenced McCullough to life imprisonment with a minimum of 31 years. The judge described a brutal, frenzied attack on a woman he professed to love, carried out in the full knowledge that she was pregnant. He also noted a detail that had stayed largely out of view until sentencing. And again, while I don't usually get into these details, here it's necessary to understand the criminal in question. The judge mentioned that McCullough had intentionally placed Natalie's face in a dog bowl, an act he characterized as an aggravating factor. It was, according to the judge, some sort of sick act of perceived punishment for an offense that only existed in the mind of this deranged individual. Personally, I think that McCullough is lucky to have gotten 31 years, but his lawyers seem to disagree. Within a month after the sentencing, they had reportedly filed an appeal against the 31-year sentence, though whether anything will come of this remains to be seen.